Are we ready?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. We asked everyone to join us this afternoon to make sure everyone is up to date on the incidents that occurred yesterday involving the response of our officers to a subject in a mental health crisis. Yesterday at approximately 4:13 p.m., the Emergency Communications Center received a 911 call from a female caller reporting that her son was at 2145 Freeman Avenue and was threatening suicide. The caller stated that her son, now identified to us as Mr. Caleb Moore, a male 24 years of age, had a history of schizophrenia and also suffered from bipolar disorder. Uniformed officers responded to the scene and they met with Mr. Moore's brother, who stated he was concerned about Caleb's mental health and that his brother had not eaten in several days. After talking with Mr. Moore and his brother, the officers grew concerned for Caleb's safety and determined that he should be transported to the University Hospital Psychiatric Emergency Service Center. At this point, the officers spent 12 minutes on scene talking to Mr. Moore and his brother, trying to encourage him to go to psych emergency services. Now I want to play for you the 911 call.
911, it's 2145 Freeman Avenue.
2145 Freeman, is that B like dog or B like boy?
B like boy.
Okay, what's your name?
Crystal Pearl Moore.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened, what's going on.
I am not really sure what's going on, but my son had gone down to visit my other son, and we got a message to call 911.
He didn't say why?
No, he didn't say why.
Okay.
I know we have been concerned about my youngest son trying to harm himself. And he was going to go down to try to talk with him or try to see if he could give him some help. So I'm not sure what happened.
Okay.
Well, my son has been kind of threatening suicide is Caleb Moore. K-A-L-E-B-M-O-O.
Okay, so the son that called you is Walter, but your son that's been threatening suicide is Caleb?
Yes.
Okay. Is he male black, male white?
He's male black.
Okay, how old is he?
He's 23.
Okay. Is he diagnosed with anything?
He does have a history of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
Okay. Okay, so is he saying like if there's a medical emergency?
I am not really sure. I don't know what's going on. I just need to try to...
Well, I got this in for police and fire, okay? If you get any more information, can you please call us back?
Okay, this is the address in front of 2145 Freeman Avenue. Now I want to read for you a sequence of events, and then we will play two body camera footage from the officers on the scene. At this point, the officers had been on scene for 12 minutes talking with Mr. Moore. Mobile Crisis had also been contacted. They did, in fact, respond to the scene. However, as this unfolded, with Mr. Moore being in possession of a knife, they were unable to engage with him. As the officers began to approach Mr. Moore, he told the officers not to touch him and get away from him. Mr. Moore then pushes away from the officers. He removes his sweatshirt and then pulls a steak knife from his waistband. Officers give Mr. Moore several commands to drop the knife. Sergeant Dan Carter, who also responded to the scene, deployed 4 beanbag shotgun rounds at Mr. Moore in an attempt to disarm him. The beanbag round struck Mr. Moore, however, had little effect, and he does not drop the knife. Sergeant Carter then places the beanbag shotgun on the ground and transitions to his taser. As Sergeant Carter does this, police officer Christopher Louderman deploys his taser at Mr. Moore, and none of them have any effect on Mr. Moore. Sergeant Carter then deploys his taser twice at Mr. Moore. As Sergeant Carter's first deployment misses, but the second deployment strikes Mr. Moore in the shoulder and the leg and still has no effect. Officer Louderman deploys his taser at Mr. Moore a second time and again has no effect. Sergeant Carter then sprays Mr. Moore with chemical irritant, but it has no effect on him either. Sergeant Carter then goes to his patrol vehicle and he retrieves more beanbag rounds while watching Mr. Moore. Sergeant Carter, as you will see on the body-worn cam footage, he reaches into his car window and he inadvertently grabs a box of 12-gauge shotgun slugs. He reloads his beanbag shotgun with a live 12-gauge shotgun slug round. As Mr. Moore continues to wield a knife and resist the officer, Sergeant Carter announces over his radio that he's going to deploy another beanbag round. Sergeant Carter then fires what he believes is another beanbag round at Mr. Moore. The round misses Mr. Moore, goes into a nearby garbage can. Sergeant Carter immediately realizes, due to the sound, the recoil of the shotgun, that he had inadvertently fired a lethal round at Mr. Moore. Sergeant Carter immediately disengages, then unloads the shotgun, places it on the floorboard of the vehicle, and he then informs a command officer what occurred, and our criminal investigation is called to the scene to investigate. Sergeant Kara Graves also responds to the scene and deploys 5 pepper ball rounds at Mr. Moore. The pepper ball rounds strike Mr. Moore in the upper body but have little effect on him, and he does not drop the knife. Now, at this point, I want to play the body-worn cam footage from one of the initial responding officers and then the body-worn cam from Sergeant Carter. This is Mr. Moore and his brother in the background. Now we're going to play the body-worn cam from Sergeant Carter. This is Sergeant Carter's body cam.
He's got a knife. Get up here. Tase him. What's down the ball? Get him down. We're gonna need more cars. I got a man with a knife. We tried to use a taser, it didn't work. We tried to use the beanbag, it didn't work.
I copy your location.
2147 Freeman.
Copy 2147 Freeman.
Shoot him.
Officer Nico says.
I'm out. I
21.
used them all up.
Freeman, 2147 Freeman, officer needing assistance. Subject has been cased and not paid back. Currently has a knife. He is responding 2147 Freeman. Loading bag 1639.
Hang on, I got more.
This is Sergeant Carter reloading.
I'm gonna try the beanbag again.
Copy is empty the meat bag again. We're holding the channel.
Shit. God damn it.
Realizing that was not a beanbag round. Mr. Moore continues to not respond to the directions given. The SWAT team is called, response to the scene. They relieve the positions of the uniform officers and begin a negotiation and an attempt to further encourage Mr. Moore to drop the knife. Several hours later, at approximately 9:23 p.m., SWAT officers deploy a 40 millimeter sponge round and additional tasers at Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore is incapacitated long enough for SWAT officers to disarm him and take him into custody. Mr. Moore is then transported to University Hospital for treatment and evaluation. Mr. Moore currently is being held under a 72-hour psych hold and has also been charged with inducing panic and resisting arrest. Mr. Moore sustained minor abrasions to his chest and arms during the incident, being struck with beanbag rounds and pepper ball rounds. This is a picture of what our beanbag shotguns look like, clearly fluorescent orange, marked with less lethal. Those firearms are only in the possession of our supervisors and those officers that have been specially trained. They're not in every police vehicle. Sergeant Carter, being a shift supervisor, was in possession of one of those firearms. Sergeant Carter, this is Mr. Moore. A little bit about Sergeant Carter. He joined the police department in 1992 and is currently assigned to District 1 patrol second shift. The incident, following our normal protocols, will be under review by the Hamilton County Prosecutor's Office. There will also be concurrent investigations by our Internal Investigations Section and CCA. We will certainly be examining what took place here. I did have an opportunity this morning to speak with Mr. Moore's family to explain to them what occurred. They were very complimentary of the actions of the officers and the patience it took to take Mr. Moore into custody, and very understanding of what occurred here. All right, at this point, I'll try to answer any questions you may have.
Chief, you see him go back to the car. Is there any other video that you guys are reviewing to see where his attention was when he was grabbing these rounds?
Absolutely. There are videos from all the officers on scene. We'll be examining. These were the most pertinent that we wanted to show for the purposes of this press conference. Obviously, Sergeant Carter's body-worn camera and the camera of the first officer that had the best view of what occurred.
So when you're talking about the live rounds versus the non-lethal rounds or beanbag rounds, whatever you call them, I mean, I think people would have an image that you've got a live casing and just a beanbag. What is there a different feel to the two of them?
They're very different. Our beanbag slugs are translucent. You can almost see through them. It's very evident. The other shotgun rounds are either red or gray in color. They're very different here. I think we have a situation of inattention on the part of Sergeant Carter in this reload, something that we will certainly be looking at as a part of this investigation.
Sorry, some questions are coming in from Zoom.
Okay.
So from Catherine Robinson from Local 12, the BMAC rounds look and feel like shotgun rounds.
They're in the same shape of shotgun rounds. They are still fired from a shotgun. However, as you can see, they're very different. Our shotguns are fluorescent orange. The officers and supervisors that are allowed to use them have undergone special training regarding that. They're kept separate. Sergeant Carter, being a supervisor, had access to that. He also had access to the extra ammunition for it, and he clearly inadvertently loaded the wrong ammunition.
Another question from the Inquirer from Madeline. How many hours of mental health training do officers go through, and what is the core of that training?
There's a significant amount of mental health training, and I don't have the exact hours right now. I believe they go through a minimum of 40 hours, and they receive special certification for that. And again, we also work very closely with the mobile crisis team. They were called to the scene here. Also, a medical doctor from the SWAT team was also on scene here. So we did have crisis intervention help and an MD on scene here. However, we're still dealing with an individual armed with a knife. And, I think other than what happened here with Sergeant Carter, I think our officers showed amazing patience. This went on, again, almost 5 hours in order to bring Mr. Moore into custody as peacefully as possible.
So to clarify, you were saying this happened within the first 12 minutes of the response?
They were on scene 12 minutes prior to what we showed you on the body when you see the decision to take Mr. Moore into custody.
Another question from Segan from the Inquirer. Could this have been handled more effectively?
We will always look at every incident to learn from and to do things better. And in the interest of transparency, there clearly was a mistake made here. That's why I called this press conference. I wanted to make sure that we were bringing this out to make sure that everyone is aware of what occurred here so that we can make certain that things are done better in the future.
Do you guys have a specific way that you store your lethal and non-lethal rounds? I mean, that they're that close to one another?
We do. And again, Sergeant Carter being a supervisor, he has access to that. something that the average officer would not. The expectation is that the supervisor will disseminate this ammunition and make sure it goes in the proper place. In this particular case, Sergeant Carter had the access to the weapon and to the ammunition.
So are you saying that they were improperly stored in his vehicle? I mean, if they're sitting right next to
What I'm saying is that he has access to it stored in his vehicle, yes.
Another question from Madeline from the Inquirer. So people have seen examples of how debilitating impact weapons like beanbag shotguns, rubber bullets, chemical grenades, and taser can be. Why in this case was the suspect not fazed by these methods?
You know, I don't want to speculate, but you can clearly see we've used all of the tools on our continuum: chemical irritant, pepper ball, taser, the beanbag shotgun, and he still did not comply. I believe, and that we all are aware that sometimes people in mental health crisis can not feel pain the same way that the average person would, and I think this is a prime example of that.
Another question from Catherine Robinson from Local 12. Is there any sort of protocol when reloading or preparing to fire both lethal and non-lethal firearms?
You know, and we train that way, and there is protocol with that. Officers are trained to move up and down that continuum as needed. As you can see, when he fired the initial 4 rounds, he placed the shotgun down, transitioned to his taser, transitioned to his firearm, and back and forth, depending on how the situation was unfolding.
You said the mobile crisis team was called in to this.
Correct.
Talk about their role. I mean, obviously, there was conversations to be had with him before it escalated to this, 12 minutes prior. What's their role? How quick are they often on scene for these situations?
So normally we have them embedded in 3 of our 5 districts that they are able to respond more readily. This occurred on a Saturday, so they had to call someone in from home. So I'm sure there was a lag in response time. But our experience is that when a weapon is involved, that is not something that they will actively engage in. That's when they more often than not call us. And then also, they're more often than not, our officers engage with people that are suffering from mental health crises at time, and they come into custody very peacefully, very uneventfully. It is actually rare that these things turn violent. In this particular case, it did.
I think you already said this, but another question about Caleb Moore's condition.
Currently, he's at University Hospital, I believe. He's suffering from some other medical conditions not related to what occurred on this scene. What he sustained here were minor abrasions. And he's also there for psychiatric evaluation as well.
To be clear, he was not hit with the shotgun round?
He was not hit with the shotgun round, correct.
No further questions. Go ahead.
Anything else? All right, thank you.